Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review, recap, and analysis of The Leftovers Season 3, Episode 7, The Most Powerful Man in the World and His Identical Twin Brother. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of The Leftovers, so I'll have to start with this spoiler warning for The Leftovers up to Season 3, Episode 7. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So I was just totally blown away by this episode, so much so that I thought instead of doing my normal 10-20 minutes review, I'm going to be doing a very long, very in-depth analysis of this episode, as I was completely blown away by it, and I think it totally warrants it. So as expected, this episode was very reminiscent of the Season 2 episode International Assassin, as they are both about Kevin's surreal journey into the afterlife. But more than that, they are very similar in tone of being very bizarre, sometimes even absurdly so, and also being highly metaphorical and abstract. There was some worry that this episode would seem a bit repetitive or not as fresh. However, I would even go as far to say that this episode is even better than International Assassin. There was just so much meaning and deeper metaphorical meaning that could be interpreted in so many different ways. It's almost like a piece of art, and in my opinion, even deeper and more intricate than International Assassin. I mean, really, I could, there's so much depth in this episode. I could spend hours upon hours analyzing the different meanings and interpretations, and it was just pulled off so well. So first off, I have to talk about the opening credits, as to be honest, I'm not really a fan of how this season has, every episode has a different song going over the opening credits. But this week, we get the opening theme from Season 1, which I thought was a really interesting choice. Many people are saying it gives the series a sense of going full circle, seeing how this is the penultimate episode of the show. And when I think about it, though, the episode is more reminiscent of Season 2 than it is of Season 1. However, the cheerful, upbeat song of Season 2 doesn't really seem that appropriate for this episode, and the more melancholy, somber theme of Season 1 does seem to fit a lot more to me. And to be honest, just hearing the music again gives me chills. But most of the music chosen for the opening credits this season, the music doesn't really seem to go along with the visuals, but that's fine. So the episode starts off with a flashback of Kevin and Nora together in the bathtub. Now, at first, I thought this was taking place during the 3-year gap between seasons 2 and 3, as this is before Kevin grew a beard, and we hear Lily over the intercom, so she's still there. But Nora mentions that Matt would want her to be buried in the cemetery where their parents are buried, and she referred to it as being a mile from here, so obviously they're still in Mapleton in the scene. So that actually places it between seasons 1 and 2, or the early part of season 2 before they move to Miracle. So again, much like many things in this episode, the inclusion of this flashback could be interpreted in any number of ways. The one that seems most obvious is that it is showing how important his relationship with Nora is to him, and it's going to be a central theme in his journey in the afterlife. And for another, it shows a time before he had his beard and a different person that he used to be, which is one of the personas he takes in the afterlife. And of course, what they're actually talking about has a lot of relevance, as they're discussing what they want done with their bodies once they die. And this episode, after all, is about Kevin dying. Now, Nora says she wants to be cremated, which is quite ironic, seeing how she wants to step in this radiation machine, which will most likely just incinerate her. And Kevin jokes about being stuffed like a taxidermy animal, which could have meaning in the fact that he wants his presence still felt after he dies. So that was interesting. So then we go to the present where we see Kevin Sr. and the others waking up after Lori drugged them, and he starts freaking out, looking at John's watch because he sees that it is the day of the 7th anniversary of the departure, and that is a huge storm on the way. So he just assumes that Lori drugged them so she could talk Kevin out of it, and that he's gone, but Michael spots his horse, saying that he is in fact still there. So they go outside to find Kevin drowning himself in the pond using the same seesaw Grace used to drown the other Kevin. And Kevin Sr. yells out to the others to get him out of there as soon as possible. And this actually puzzled me, as isn't this what they wanted him to do? And in fact, Kevin yells at them, "What are you doing?" And Sr. asks, "Well, what are you doing?" To which he answers, "Well, what you want me to do." So it's like, duh. But Senior says that he thought they'd do it together, so I suppose it's all about them wanting to be there for it. So Kevin does a check real quick with the people who want him to do stuff, John, Grace, and Senior, and then tells Senior to just let go, which in practical terms refers to him letting go of the seesaw, but of course that phrase has a deeper meaning as well, that Senior needs to let him go. So back under Kevin goes, and we start hearing the same music that played in the hotel at the International Assassin episode. So we knew we were about to get into the afterlife, and I was so pumped. But instead of a hotel, Kevin burst out of the ocean at a beach where he's being attacked by a random Russian who refers to him as Kevin Harvey, which is the same alias he used in the afterlife before, which again just speaks to the absurdity of this afterlife, that their idea of having an alias is switching out one letter of his last name. So Kevin, of course, is disorientated and doesn't know what's going on while this big muscle man kicks his ass and pulls a knife on him, but in comes Dean, the dog shooting guy, who takes out the muscle man with one shot to the head, ironically pretty much the same way that he died. And while Kevin was defensive, we learned he is actually there to help Kevin. So this scene was very James Bondish, as was most of the episode, and I think that's the point. Most of the show has a sense of realism, but this afterlife isn't meant to have this sense of realism. It makes me, it makes sense to me that Kevin doesn't know much about what it's like to be an actual international assassin, and most of what he knows is from watching films like James Bond. So it makes sense that the afterlife would be shaped by his understanding of it. Plus, it's really dreamlike the way, absurd and strange things just happen. So I was really hoping to see Dean in the afterlife after we saw him die earlier this season. I'm a tad disappointed we didn't see more of him, as he fits really well into this absurd universe, as he's always had a bizarre feel to him. And the way he just rushed Kevin into the hut and quickly brought him up to speed on everything fits so well with his character. So in the scene, Dean explains the purpose of the afterlife this time, as it doesn't take place in a hotel. Dean outlines that he is an international assassin and he's being sent on a mission to assassinate the President of the United States, as he plans to launch an unprovoked nuclear strike. So this is interesting, as last couple of times Kevin went to the afterlife, he was able to choose his profession, which dictated what would happen to him. But this time he couldn't choose, he was automatically an international assassin. But this could be because that's what he chose the first time he went there, because his plot was to assassinate Patti, so he sort of established himself as an international assassin. And another interesting aspect about his persona is that he no longer has his beard, almost like the version of him from when he went to the afterlife left. It's like what he left behind in this afterlife that he visited 3 years ago. So Dean smashes the mirror and all reflective surfaces and warns him not to look at any reflective surfaces. That reminds me, this reminds me a bit of like International Assassin, when Virgil told Kevin not to drink any of the water, as it seems, each time in the afterlife they have like a set of rules to follow. But then Dean gives him an earpiece that lets him communicate with the mission control operator that turns out to be none other than David Burton. And what's interesting here is that unlike most other people Kevin meets in the afterlife that simply takes on whatever persona fits the scenario that he's playing out, David Burton seems more self-aware, as he remembered meeting Kevin in the afterlife the other time, as when Kevin asks if he knows him, he starts singing that same song he had Kevin sing in order to get back to the world of the living. So they actually bring up a mystery that I had forgotten all about, as when David Burton met Kevin on the bridge in the afterlife, he whispered something to him. Now, we, the audience at the time, had no idea what it was he was whispering, but here he asked Kevin if he remembered what it was he whispered to him, and he says it was that he was the most powerful man in the world, to which David Burton replies, "You're goddamn right." So I do think that this is what the writers, I do not think this is what the writers had intended from the very beginning when they wrote David Burton whispering to Kevin. I don't think they knew when they had made that episode that he'd be saying, "You're the most powerful man in the world." I don't think there's a chance in hell that that's the case. More likely, they just wanted to leave the door open and have him say something weird, and if it made sense for the plot later on, then they could reveal what it was. If not, they just leave it out as just another unexplained occurrence, but it just so happens to become relevant again, so they take the opportunity to tie it in to the theme of the episode. Now, don't get me wrong though, I think it works great and actually fits pretty seamlessly, so I don't begrudge them doing this at all. So anyway, despite what Dean and David Burton specifically tells Kevin to look in the mirror, and when Kevin protests that he was told not to, David Burton says, if you want to do what you came here to do, look in the mirror. So he does. Now, what he came here for is an interesting question, one that will be addressed several times during his journey. His official reason for being there is to deliver John's message to Evie, talk to Grace's children to find out what happened to their shoes, and to get the song from Christopher Sunday that Kevin Sr. needs to sing to stop the floods and stop the end of the world. And indeed, he does seem to retain that as his main goals, as he tells Dean his conditions for doing this assassination job is that he must be able to meet with these people that he's supposed to talk to. And this is where we learn that Christopher Sunday is the Prime Minister of Australia in this world. Why exactly that is, I'm not sure, but there it is. So David Burton tells him to look in the mirror, so he does, and suddenly finds himself on the podium giving a speech to a large crowd of people. He once again has his beard, so it's apparent to me this persona of him more represents the person that he has become over the past 3 years since his time in the afterlife. In fact, I suspect the whole reason they gave him a beard this season was so they could differentiate between Season 2 Kevin and Season 3 Kevin, who we meet both of them in this episode. Of course, another interesting aspect of the beard was revealed in the flashback at the start of the episode, where it was Nora who wanted him to grow the beard in the first place. So the beard ties him to Nora even more. So anyway, Kevin finds himself on the stage wearing all white and addressing a crowd in all white, where he reads words off a teleprompter. It's interesting, the first words he's meant to read are "Good day, Melbourne," because this no doubt ties into his recent experience revolving the show of the same name. He then says that he loves visiting the other side of the world, and each time he finds it harder and harder to leave. So now I find the wording of this very significant, because he didn't say your country or Australia, he said the other side of the world, so I think that's meant to mean the afterlife in this context, and each time he goes there he finds it harder and harder to leave. That most definitely means the afterlife. Anyway, he keeps reading from the teleprompter until it dawns on him that he is the president, which is something I figured out as soon as I saw him on stage, but whatever. I love how this was done, though, as he was reading a speech about, introducing legislation, and then he pauses and then just says, "I'm the president," and then everyone cheers. It was something so beautifully absurd about that just adds to the atmosphere perfectly, and I must admit I laughed out loud when I saw that. But anyway, he goes on in his speech to talk about how their platform was to dissolve marriage. And then he talks about how they used to smoke cigarettes and not talk. So this seems to be in a world in which the guilty remnant have taken over. Now, I think this may support my theory that the ATFAC, or whatever they're called, wiped out the guilty remnant entirely, and that's why there's so many of them in the afterlife, but that's probably reaching, but hey, I'm sticking to it. In any event, it's interesting that they talk about a platform of dissolving marriage, as the last time he was in the afterlife, Patti was a politician who talked about dissolving family. And in that time, Kevin was worried about getting his family back, but this time his relationship with his family is strong. That is, his daughter and his son are okay. It's his relationship with his lover that is in peril. So it's interesting that the focus has switched from family to marriage. So he then announces the winner of an essay contest on why family doesn't matter, and it turns out to be one of Grace's children, and all of her children are sitting in the front row, and they are not wearing shoes. So Kevin takes the time to ask what happened to their shoes, and Liam replies, "Why does it matter?" And then Kevin answers that someone in his family wants to know, which I knew was the wrong thing to say because the whole theme here at this speech was family doesn't matter. So Liam's response was to say, "But you said there is no family." And then everyone started cheering, which again adds to the surreal feeling of everything. Now, several things interesting about this. First of all is Liam's response, "Why does it matter?" which I think does clearly state that it doesn't matter, and whether or not Grace knows the answer will ultimately make no difference in her life. The fact that he said, "I thought you said there is no family," also reinforces that Kevin still has doubts about his own family. So Evie then appears as a protester who disrupts his speech, singing the song "Love Will Keep Us Together," and she's wearing a red shirt very similar to the one the protesters who disrupted Matt's baptism wore, which is really interesting because in real life, Evie was a member of the guilty remnant that boasted that there is no family, so here she's taking a complete 180 and is now assuming the role of a protester who's protesting that thought. So if you do believe that this is a genuine afterlife, this could mean that Evie changed her mind about everything since her death. So Kevin is rushed off stage by his Secret Service agents, the main one being the same Kevin, chief of police that Grace killed, which is interesting. And Kevin is then told that there's a nuclear crisis and that he needs to attend to, but he refuses to go anywhere until he speaks to Evie. And then we get another surreal conversation with Kevin talking to his chief of staff on the phone, who tells him he's going to a secure location where someone with his unique biometrics, only someone with his unique biometrics can get in. And then we get an absurd line about unless you have an identical twin brother, which would be ridiculous, and it just adds to the absurdity of everything. But the chief of staff then suggests that they go to DEFCON 2, but when Kevin refuses, he says that the Secretary of Defense won't like it, to which he replies, "Fuck the Secretary of Defense," which is cool to see Kevin asserting his authority in this world. So Kevin then arrives at his limo where Evie is brought to him, so he insists that she come along with her so they can talk. So Kevin asks her if she knows who he is and if she knows that he's not really the president, to which she answers yes. So Kevin then tells her he has a message from her father, which seems to take her back, so he tells her the message is that she is loved, which seems to touch her deeply. But then Kevin asks if she has a message for him, to which she replies, "Are you fucking kidding me?" and then tells him that her father, mother, and brother were all killed in a drone strike ordered by his administration. And he says that that's not what happened, that she's the one who died in a drone strike, and her response, of course, is to say that's ridiculous because I'm right fucking here. So Evie, unlike David Burton, seems totally caught up in this character that she's playing in this scenario. So even if you believe that this is the afterlife, it's still up in the air on whether or not this is Evie, as it could be an operation of Kevin's mind. So in the context of this world, though, when Kevin told her her message from her father, I think she took it at face value, as he could have said this before he died. But the thing about wanting to get a message to him made no sense to her. And again, this is significant change in Evie's character, which shows her that she does have love for her family, and it means a lot to her, as opposed to in season 2, she insisted it meant nothing to her, and this could be interpreted in any number of ways, and I'll get back to this a bit more later on. What's also worth noting in the scene is in the context of the character when Kevin asks her if he's the president, she says no, and later clarifies that he's just a puppet who is being used, and then asks what he wants. So this line most definitely has greater meaning, as it basically gets to why Kevin returned to the afterlife, as his stated purpose is to do favors for John, Grace, and his father. So basically, he is being used and is just a puppet. And the whole time that he's been in the afterlife so far, he has been focused on doing these tasks for other people and never stopped to ask himself why he was here. And I'm sure he was telling himself that he was just doing it for these people, but this was the first time he was confronted by it. Anyway, Kevin starts freaking out and spitting up water, and next thing we see, he returns to the land of the living, with John and Michael carrying him back to the house during a massive storm. Kevin seems upset to be pulled away from the afterlife world and asks why they did it, to which they reply the whole farm was flooding. The first thing Kevin does, however, is to tell John that he was just with Evie, and he delivered his message, to which John seemed incredibly relieved and happy to hear. Now, I've got to point out the blaring irony here that for a living, John tells people he communicates with their deceased loved ones in order to make them feel better and to give them closure. Does he actually communicate with them? No. He just gets Lori to gather information on them so he can pretend that he does. But here, Kevin is essentially doing the same thing for John that he does for other people. But is Kevin lying to John? No. But is he lying by omission, as he doesn't tell John the full story? He does tell him that Evie he met in the afterlife was caught up. He doesn't tell him that the Evie he met in the afterlife was caught up in a persona based off of a narrative, which obviously is tailored toward him, and that this Evie has no recollection of her real life and believes that she is still alive and that her family is dead. But she seemed... She did seem touched by the fact that her father said that she was loved, and her whole purpose in this narrative was to highlight the importance of family. Now, had Kevin given all this information, it may have still made John feel better, and maybe still would have given him closure, but maybe not. Maybe not to the extent it did. In any event, it would have given him more to think about and brought more complexity to it, including the possibility that what Kevin experienced wasn't real, and it wasn't really Evie, and just a construct of Kevin's mind. But Kevin simply says, "I delivered your message," in which allows John to have closure, and thus Kevin does for John what John does for all these other people. However, he tells Grace that he saw her children there too, and she asks if they're okay, to which he simply replied, they don't know what happened to the shoes. Now here, Kevin does lie, because that's not what they said. When he asked them what happened to the shoes, their response was, why does it matter? Which is not the same thing as saying, I don't know. And that answer does have deeper meaning in the regard that it doesn't really matter what happened to their shoes, and it's just something that Grace has, sort of been clinging on to want to give her children's death more meaning, or try to ascribe a greater mystery to it. But Liam's response is basically stating outright, it doesn't really matter, and it won't change how Grace feels. And of course, this theme goes along with the greater theme of the entire show, with the mystery of the departure, how everyone wants to know what happened to the missing people, but knowing that won't actually make them feel any better, and ultimately the mystery doesn't matter. And this is also highlighted in what Lori said last week about how she doesn't try to con people and tell them they know what happened to the departed, because they actually don't want to know. And so, like the departure, the mystery of the missing shoes will never be resolved because the answer isn't important. At least not as important as far as the characters of this world are concerned, and that's what the show is all about. Also, Kevin also withheld information from Grace by not mentioning the persona her children took in this world, were the persona of guilty remnants, saying having parents doesn't matter, and basically trying to forget that they have parents, as they most likely died feeling abandoned by their parents. And had Kevin mentioned any of this to Grace, this would have devastated her and made her feel much worse. In fact, Kevin purposely avoided the question of are they okay, and this was actually the kinder thing to do on Kevin's part, because had he given her the greater context of where he saw their children, that would have destroyed her. And then Kevin Sr. asks, what about the song? To which Kevin replies that he was working on it, but he was pulled away and he wants to get back so he can finish the task. So he asks to be taken to the bathroom. So they fill up the tub with water and get ready to drown Kevin in it. But John starts freaking out, showing his concern for Kevin. But Senior gets really upset and is like, "Oh, sure, now that you have what you want, you're worried about his safety." And I actually think that Kevin Sr. has a point here, that John was only on board with this in order to get what he wanted, and now that he has it, he has no reason to go along with it. That being said, Kevin Sr. would have been the same way had he got what he wanted first. So Sr. is still convinced Kevin needs to go to the afterlife in order to get the song he needs to sing to save the world, but Michael points out that that's not why Kevin is doing it, and when Kevin asks, well, why else would I be doing it, Michael responded simply by saying, well, I don't know. Why are you doing it? So Michael is the second one to question Kevin's motive in going to the afterlife. And what's really interesting is when Michael asked him why he's doing it, we got a flash image of Nora in the tub. So that's our first clue that Kevin's true motivations for doing what he's doing has something to do with Nora. So Kevin Sr. then locks John and Michael up, out of the room and refuses to listen to them while they bang on the door. So now Kevin, for his part, does seem eager to get back to the afterlife. And then we get this really touching moment between father and son where Kevin Sr. tells his son that if he could do this, he would. And then he says, "I love you, son," to which he replies, "I love you too." Now this is a touching moment between father and son, probably the first time in many years these two have connected in such a way. But this moment is a bit colored by the surrounding circumstances, because Kevin Sr. never thought to open up to his son when Kevin was dismissive of what he was saying and that he was crazy. It wasn't until Kevin accepted what he was saying about the end of the world needing to sing a song to save it that Senior admitted that he loved him. So in a way, Senior's motivation here is a bit selfish, and Kevin is hiding ulterior motives that have nothing to do with wanting to help his father. So this kind of taints this loving moment. So Senior holds Kevin down underwater, and Kevin once again finds himself in the world of the afterlife, this time as the president, just as he left, and he's preparing to enter the secure location in which he needs to have his face scanned, but apparently that's not good enough. He also has to have his penis scanned. Now this part of it I wasn't so on board with. I know the whole thing about the afterlife has this sort of absurd feel to it. Now this may seem like a minor nitpick, but absurd fits into the dark feel of the show perfectly, whereas silly does not. Silly is something more of like a Will Ferrell or Adam Sandler comedy, and that's what the whole penis scanner thing felt like to me, just juvenile and dumb. Now you could say there was a deeper meaning, metaphor to it, like it signified that his love had something to do with his love life, which as we know is ultimately what this is all about, but I still think it was dumb. Anyway, the Australian Kevin also mentions there are 3 security questions he has to answer before they let him in. Standard password questions like, what is the name of your childhood pet and what was your favorite movie? I love when Kevin answered The Godfather. The Australian Kevin looked at him as if there was more, and he had to specify part 2. That was a nice touch. But the third question was, who was the Secretary of Defense, to which Kevin didn't know the real answer, so he had to pause, but he had to think about it, and finally he said Patti Levin, in which the security service agent confirmed was correct. So I've heard some speculation on whether or not by saying Patti Levin was the Secretary of Defense that actually made it so. But I see it more as a sort of chicken and the egg situation. That this world is obviously dictated by Kevin's subconscious. And that is to say, is sort of tailor-made for him by his thoughts. So it's just a matter of digging into his subconscious to find the correct answer. So he gets into the bunker and we meet Patti, the Secretary of Defense, who continues to insist they go to DEFCON 1 because of the threat of Ukrainian separatists seizing control of a nuclear submarine. Now again, this sounds like a plot from a movie. Has does all these like security measures. It seems like something right out of a movie. And again, this makes sense because most of what Kevin knows about these types of things is from movies. Because I don't see why Ukrainian separatists would want to launch a nuclear attack on the U.S. Sounds more like something that we'd hear in a movie. But Patti asks that the Secret Service agents leave the room, and after Kevin nods for them the okay, they do so. And then Patti starts freaking out and hitting him and being like, "Why are you dicking around? We've been planning this for a long time." Of course, we're still not sure what the plan is at this stage, but then the Australian Kevin knocks on the door and tells them the vice president wants to speak to him, and he refers to the vice president as a she, which surprises Kevin. Now, as to who the vice president was going to be, I had two guesses, either Meg or Lori. I was expecting to see either one of them, and it turned out it was Meg. Now, the fact that Lori doesn't in fact appear in this afterlife at all reinforces the theory that this isn't the afterlife and is just inside Kevin's head. Or could be that this is really the afterlife, but still this entire world is shaped by what Kevin knows, because Kevin at this stage doesn't know that Lori's dead. So were she to appear, it would be confirmation that this is an actual afterlife that goes beyond Kevin's perception. And that's a step I don't think the show wanted to take. I think they want to leave it more ambiguous and up to the audience to decide. And also having Meg be the vice president makes sense in terms that this character turns out to be more of an antagonist who doesn't have Kevin's best interests at heart, which Meg fits this role a lot better. So Meg claims that there is no real threat and demands to know what's going on. Kevin insists that Patti tell her, and of course the real reason he does this is because he wants to hear it for himself. So Patti explains that they plan to launch nuclear weapons at Russia, who will retaliate with their own nuclear weapons, and thus everyone in the world will die. As Patti says, people are expecting the apocalypse on the 7th anniversary of departure, so she wants to give the people what they want, and what they want is to die. Now this is interesting in bringing up suicide again, but this time saying the whole world wants to die. But this gets back to the fact that this is all in Kevin's head, and he pretty much wanted to die so he could come here. And then there's Nora, who seems intent on going to that radiation machine, which most likely will kill her. So anyway, Meg says their plan won't work because of the Fisher protocol. And again, Kevin asks her to explain it to prove that she knows what it is, but really he wants her to tell him so he can know what it is. And apparently it's that the key to the launch, the nuclear weapons, is embedded in the heart of a volunteer, and he has to rip it out of this volunteer's heart in order to launch the nuclear weapons. And I think Kevin had already figured out this meant the other Kevin that he was being. When he was him, he noticed that he had an operational scar around the area of his heart. But Patti confirms that this is in fact the volunteer, and Kevin knows that the other Kevin is headed here. So when Meg asks how he'll be able to get through the security door, he answers, because he's my identical twin brother. So Meg is like, okay, I see you thought this through, and leaves. So Kevin states again he wants to talk to the Australian Prime Minister. And Patti's just like, okay, but first you have to go to DEFCON 1. And he's like, fine. So he speaks into the little nuclear football and says, we're at DEFCON 1. And then alarms go off and everything shuts down and the phone doesn't work and he can't leave the room. So Patti was just lying to him. And that doesn't really make much sense. So Kevin starts freaking out and snatches her glasses right off her face so he can look into his reflection. So he then finds himself in the assassin's body again. But here's the thing that bothers me. You know, if taking them to DEFCON 1 is the thing that shut everything down and locked them in the room, couldn't he just take them back to DEFCON 2 or DEFCON 3 and unlock the doors? I mean, if all he has to do is to change the DEFCON is to speak in that little microphone thingy and say, we're at DEFCON 1, why not just do the same thing and say, hey, we're at DEFCON 2? So this just seems a bit of a contrived way to force Kevin to get back into the assassin's body, but really, you know, it does seem like there were alternatives. So anyway, Kevin finds himself in the assassin's body on a rooftop looking into a sniper rifle outside the compound, and David Burton is talking in his earpiece telling him to kill the guards and go inside, but Kevin notices that there are no guards and says that it's a trap. They want him to go inside so they can rip the launch codes from his heart, and David Burton says, well, duh, of course I knew that. So when Kevin asks why the fuck he didn't seem fit to share this information with them, he tells them that he has an asset inside and tells him to go in unarmed and his asset will protect him. He quotes the Bible and then tells Kevin to put his faith in him. So it sounds more like, once again, David Burton is speaking as if he is God. So Kevin goes in by using the penis scanner. Anyway, and as soon as he enters, the Australian Kevin and the other Secret Service agent charges at him with their guns and shout at him to get down. He does so while angry, yelling at David Burton, asking if he sold him out, and he doesn't answer. But then someone comes up and kills the Australian Kevin and the other agent, and that person is Meg. And I saw this coming a million miles away. As soon as David Burton said that he had an asset inside, I thought it was the most obvious thing in the world that he was referring to Meg. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily. Not everything needs to be a surprise, but it did seem kind of like they were trying to play it like a surprise, which it wasn't. Anywho, Meg tells Kevin, lets Kevin in and tells him how to get to the president, and she says, make sure to kill the fucking Secretary of Defense, which is interesting that Meg has this huge feud with Patti, because in real life they were both in the guilty remnant and it didn't seem like they had any hard feelings towards each other. But later, Meg would go rogue and break off from the remnant and be a bit different, but that was well after Patti died, but I suppose not everything needs to be in keeping with real life in this afterlife world. But it is interesting when Kevin asked Meg, isn't that what you people want? When she said that the president will end the world, Meg responds by saying that she's not like them, she feels and she loves. Now this could indicate that she did things different than the remnant, or perhaps like Evie, she's completely changed her perspective since coming to the afterlife. Anyway, Meg tells Kevin she's in love with the most wonderful man, and when he asks who it is, she says God. Now, to be honest, at first I thought this meant she turned all religious until David Burton said in his earpiece, tell her I love her too. And that was another laugh out loud moment. I loved it. It was so richly absurd and harkens back to David Burton going around calling himself God. But then Kevin asks for the comms room and Meg refuses at first, but when Kevin persists, she finally tells him and then he kills her. And David Burton in his earpiece asks what that noise was, and Kevin says, well, you're God, you tell me. To which David Burton says, that was just a pickup line, which is really interesting because it implies his whole thing about calling himself God is just to impress people, but that doesn't really surprise me. So then he's like, did you just fucking kill her? And Kevin replies by throwing his earpiece on the ground. Now, as cool as this scene was, I didn't really get why Kevin would shoot Meg and throw his earpiece away. They were both helping him to infiltrate the compound. In fact, David Burton was a great help, so I don't really get why he would kill Meg and just toss David Burton aside. It frankly seems like a dumb thing to do, but maybe it goes along with the fact that this Kevin wanted to get caught. So Kevin finally gets to the comm room and there's an agent there. So Kevin says he wants to speak to the Australian Prime Minister, Christopher Sunday. And at first he just stands there dumbfounded and Kevin has to shout at him to get him to do it. And once Christopher Sunday appears on the screen, he tells the agent to leave the room and he protests and saying, oh, this is my station. But then Kevin once again yells at him to get out, so he does. So the one thing I had to talk about is how many people seem to want to stop him from talking to Christopher Sunday, or otherwise they make it difficult for him. When Kevin first arrived in the Afterlife, he told Dean he needed to speak to Grace's children, Evie, and Christopher Sunday. And even then, Dean just focused on Christopher Sunday and was like, ooh, that's going to be difficult, and just ignored the Evie and the children thing. But in the very next scene, when Kevin becomes president, he immediately sees Grace's children and very soon after Evie. So it was very easy to get to them. So it seems, that seeing them was easy, but Christopher Sunday, for some reason, was a much bigger ask. The whole time, Kevin is insisting that he needs to talk to Christopher Sunday. He's behaving like it is his sole purpose and what he's supposed to do. But people keep blocking him. When he tells the Australian Kevin he needs to speak to him, he says, oh, you can once you get inside. But then he asks all these security questions before he can get inside. But once he is inside, Patti intercepts him and tells him, he tells her that he needs to speak to Christopher Sunday, and she just slaps him and then lies to him and tells him he can do so after going to DEFCON 1. But once he does, he can't because they're locked in. So she tricked him to prevent him from talking to him. And then he becomes an assassin, Kevin, and when he tells Meg he needs to go to the con rooms to talk to Christopher Sunday, she's just like, what is it with you in the fucking comms? And is being very uncooperative and is, resisting him. And then when he finally gets into the comms room, the agent there is very hesitant and is like, oh, you sure? And he has to yell to get it. So it's like everyone seemed to want to be hindering him from talking to Christopher Sunday. So it could just be in the context of this world that they find it strange that he wants to talk to the Australian Prime Minister in the middle of a nuclear crisis, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. For one thing, they're in Australia, so him wanting to speak to their Prime Minister in a time of crisis isn't that odd. But mainly, I think there's more to it than that. I think those in this afterlife world respond to him, and just like Liam, who told him what happened to their shoes isn't important, I think everyone in this world is trying to tell him that talking to Christopher Sunday isn't important, that the nuclear crisis and what that represents is actually more important to him. And now, for what that represents, I'll get to that a bit later. For now, let's talk about Christopher Sunday. So Kevin finally gets to talk to Christopher Sunday and tells him that he isn't the Prime Minister and that his father came to him for a song to stop the rain, to which he responds by saying, there is no song. Now this I find very interesting. Like David Burton, Christopher Sunday seems self-aware, unlike everyone else in this world like Evie and Meg, who are just acting a part and don't remember their real life. Christopher Sunday, on the other hand, doesn't bat an eye when he tells him that he's not the Prime Minister, and he clearly does remember his real life because he tells Kevin that he tried to tell his father, but he wouldn't listen. And there you have it. The whole quest to save the world by singing a song to stop the floods is bullshit. But of course, this shouldn't come as a big shock because of course this was crazy. I mean, a fucking chicken pecked on a tape, so Senior thinks that means he needs to sing Aboriginal songs to save the world. That's obviously insane nonsense. But Kevin and everyone else went along with it. John and Grace went along with it because they had their own personal motivations to talk to, the dead loved ones. But the big question is why Kevin went along with it, and because he was so desperately trying to get to Christopher Sunday, it does appear he was at least consciously going along with his father. And honestly, I don't think he really thought about it, nor did he consciously realize that he had ulterior motives until this very moment when Christopher Sunday pointed it out to him. At any rate, I absolutely loved this scene. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Christopher Sunday reminded me a bit of Virgil in a sense where he was giving him the cold hard truth in the afterlife. So when Kevin tells him that he needs to give him something, that his father needs to stop the floods, Christopher Sunday asks if that's what he really believes. Do you really believe that your father can sing a song and stop the flood? And Kevin pauses and thinks about it before finally answering no. So this is the first time I think Kevin is actually coming to terms with the fact that his father is simply crazy. And I love the look on Christopher Sunday's face, that he gave him. It was so gold. And then, he becomes the third person to ask the $1 million question, then why are you here? But before he can answer, the agents break in and attack him, and he tries to fight them off, but in the struggle, he smashes the screen, and when he looks to see if Christopher Sunday is still there, he instead sees his reflection, which of course causes him to switch back to the President persona. Once there, he's still looking at Patti's glasses, and she asks him if she can have her glasses back. And in yet another laugh-out-loud moment, Kevin takes the glasses and smashes them with the phone. I absolutely love that. But then the alarms stop, and Patti says that, well, it looks like they caught him. So she's ready to move forward. But Kevin says that he's just sick of this shit. So this is the first time in the afterlife that Kevin's not worrying about the reason that other people sent him. And his first reaction is to say that he's just sick of this shit. But Patti tries to keep him on track. So let's talk about Patti, because she serves a different purpose this time. As in the previous Afterlife experience, she was an adversary, but this time she's more like Kevin's best advocate that tries to keep him on track. While Kevin yells that he's not the president and that she's not the Secretary of Defense, she insists that she is, that he specifically chose her and summoned her out of retirement. Now this line could be interpreted as when Australian Kevin asked him who the Secretary of Defense was. By him answering Patti, he selected her to play that role and in fact summoned her there, but maybe not. At any rate, Patti refers to Kevin as having helped her, and we get a flash of Kevin drowning her in the well, so that could be seen as helping her find peace, as she wasn't able to rest before that, and so she feels that she owes him. And so she says that she's here to help him, and when Kevin asks how, well, she asks him, what do you want? And his response is to say, I want to go home. But her response is very interesting. She asks, do you? And then mentions that although he says that a lot, it seems he ended up returning here. So it's very interesting, because the last time he was in the afterlife, he had to sing the Homeward Bound song, which is all about returning home in order to return home. And that was, important for him. But all season long, we see him obsessed with his time that he spent in the afterlife and how he keeps wanting to go back. Now, throughout this episode, they keep showing images of Kevin putting a bag over his head, so some are speculating that Kevin returned to the afterlife place every time he did that. I personally don't think that's the case, but he did tell Nora that he did it in order to feel. And he told Lori last week that when he was in his afterlife world, he never felt so alive. So we have our answer of why he's really here, and that's because he wants to be there, because he likes it. He felt alive, and he wants to recapture this feeling. His time there affected him so much, and he liked it so much, and he was basically the most powerful man in the world. And he become obsessed with that and let that ruin his life. In the meantime, he forgot to live. Anyway, Patti tells him she's sensing a lot of internal conflicts from him, and it sounds like something that he needs to work out with himself. And the next thing we know, the Kevin assassin is being brought in the room. So it seems obvious the line of work it out with yourself is actually what happens when we have Kevin who meets and interacts with himself, basically. So I've seen a lot of speculation on what actually happens in this scene where there are two Kevins. Which one is Kevin experiencing in this moment? Is he in like two places at once? Is both of these Kevins him? Is he having like dual perspectives going at the same time? You can get very philosophical here. However, this is how I look at it. And of course, this is just my interpretation, but it's like when you talk to yourself, who are you talking to and who responds? Or to put it another way, I think the President Kevin is his conscious mind and the assassin Kevin is more like his subconscious. In other words, I believe the President Kevin is the one who is experiencing this moment, like Kevin is seeing the assassin Kevin through the President's eyes. But the assassin Kevin is also, in every sense, also Kevin, but he's basically talking to himself or his subconscious. Just like Patti said, it's something he needs to work out with himself. And in fact, I think there's a very strong reason on why this theme was chosen for this visit to the afterlife, where Kevin is split in two, both ends trying to kill each other, but ultimately they share the same goal. So it just goes to show the inner conflict that's going on within Kevin. So what's interesting here is that one Kevin is dressed in white and the other is dressed in black. This is a classic Lindelof signature of showing duality, of having black and white. This was used a lot in Lost. Now, this isn't to say that one is good and the other is evil, or even that one is light and the other is dark, but more of to show that there are two halves of the same whole. In fact, when Patti takes off the hood of the assassin Kevin, she starts singing this ridiculous song, which is another great absurd moment, by the way, about identical Kevin. They're Kevins, and she refers to them as matching bookends and different as night and day. But really, they didn't really seem all that different. But again, I believe that the assassin Kevin represents the part of him that loved his time in the afterlife, that needed to be there, as he in fact is the international assassin. Whereas the President Kevin represents who he is now, the conscious Kevin, if you will, which is why he's the most powerful man in the world. Because in the world of Kevin, he's the one who ultimately makes all the decisions. But I've been always been very fascinated with the idea of seeing a scene where someone meets another version of himself and has a conversation with this other version of himself, and it's really just him talking to himself and self-analyzing. And overall, I thought it was done so well here. So Patti then makes an official speech about invoking the Fisher Protocol. In this speech, she adds a few of her own commentary, like when she mentions Congress, if it exists, and she says it will not. And when she says, may God have mercy on your soul. And then she says, if God exists, which he does not. So that's an extremely interesting statement, considering that they're in the afterlife. Now, I'm not saying it's meant to indicate that there definitely isn't a God. It's just curious that this is Patti's stance. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but there are so many possibilities one could speculate over. She then takes out a surgical knife and hands it to President Kevin, who insists that he's not fucking killing him. And then Assassin Kevin responds, well, that's good because I'm not fucking letting him. To which Patti scolds them both by saying language, and in unison they both say, fuck you. And now this was another great laugh out loud moment that again was so richly absurd in the best way. Both Kevins then dismiss the whole thing as bullshit, but then Patti points out to Assassin Kevin that he must want this to happen because he purposely came here to this room to the one person that had the power to kill him. And then Patti brings out the book. Now, this book was alluded to earlier in the hut scene at the start of the episode, but both Kevins deny having written it. Now, I like the theme of having books be important this season, as the book of Kevin that Matt wrote was a huge catalyst for a lot of things that happened. And in fact, the book Patti brings out is in the same type of folder as Matt's book. So they are obviously trying to draw parallels with Matt's book, but I believe the main point is drawing the comparison is to show how important this book is, as it basically explains everything of what's going on. And it's funny how both Kevins at first refuse to read it and want to know nothing about it. And it's funny, Patti announces that she will read it when both Kevins refuse, but she's just like, oh, I need to get my glasses, which of course are smashed in pieces. And so after a few moments of her like trying to fit her glasses back together, Kevin gets frustrated and snatches the book from her and starts reading it. So it's a romance novel, and while it doesn't directly tell the story of what happened between him and Nora. There are a lot of parallels. And reading it, of course, is what finally gets Kevin to come face to face with that's why he's really there, because he's running away. And when he reads lines like he was a coward who wore the uniform of a hero, and made him realize why he was obsessed with his time in the afterlife, because he was scared of Nora, scared to show his true self. And in my previous reviews, I talked about how Nora was being distant and closed off with Kevin, but this makes it clear so was Kevin. Kevin refused to talk about anything real with her or to open up, and this scene clarifies it because he was a coward, and he ultimately left her because he was a coward, and then went to this afterlife in an attempt to escape her. And so after President Kevin reads the passage, Assassin Kevin asks him to rip the key out of him, and when the president asks why, he answers, "So we can never come back here again." And that's when we get the key of what's been going on here, that in order for Kevin to move on and live his life, he needs to forget his time here, and most importantly, never come back here again. So by destroying it, he took away his ability to die in the afterlife and then come back to life. He's taking away what makes him special, so I believe when he dies next, he will be dead. So we get another surreal scene of President Kevin cutting open Assassin Kevin and reaching inside of him and grabbing the key. And this is played to happy, cheerful 60s music. And I love whenever shows or films play with this contrast of happy songs played over dark scenes, if it's done right, and I absolutely feel it was done perfectly right here. And there's a lot to say about the metaphorical implications of one ripping out your own heart. So Assassin Kevin's last words are, "We fucked up with Nora." So basically this is Kevin's inner self telling Kevin this and coming to this realization that they need to move past this afterlife world and they need it to end. So Patti then guides Kevin to turn the key and launch the nukes, and then she takes his hand and goes to the rooftop to watch them destroy the world. This was a really beautiful scene, and I loved how they played the typical piano theme of The Leftovers, as I feel this was a very key moment in the entire series. So we learned that Patti was actually there to help him and do what he needed to do, and that wasn't to find Christopher Sunday so that he could feed his father's delusions, but it was to move past this afterlife experience so he can move on with his life. And it's interesting that Patti takes on the role of a helpful guide rather than an adversary, and that's why I referred to Meg as the antagonist in this scenario, because she wanted to stop him from launching the nukes and ending the world, which is actually what he needs to do. Now, there are a lot of ways to interpret this world being destroyed, but the way I look at it is this world was all about Kevin, as this was his afterlife experience, and whether or not other people that appear in this world are actually the spirits of the people who died, or if they're just apparitions of Kevin's mind, is irrelevant. The main point is this afterlife is all about Kevin's experience. So in destroying the afterlife, Kevin isn't affecting anyone else but Kevin. But that's just my way of looking at it. There are many different ways to interpret this, and that's why it's so fucking brilliant. One interpretation I heard was that this was all in Kevin's head and that he didn't really go to the afterlife. And although I would personally lean away from this interpretation, I do think the show purposely left it open for this to be possible, even more so than the first time. As I said earlier, the fact that we didn't see Laurie because Kevin doesn't know yet that Laurie's dead could be an indication that it was all inside Kevin's head. And other things can be explained away, such as seeing Australian Kevin could be explained by the fact Kevin could have seen the Australian Kevin's dead body while he was at Grace's ranch. And Grace stated that she showed pictures of her dead children to Kevin, so that's how he would know what they looked like. And Kevin could have seen like a news story of David Burton and integrated that into his first afterlife experience, and then John could have told him about how they met someone on the ferry over a named David Burton who referred to himself as God. But honestly, I think all this is stretching a bit, and the biggest flaw in this theory to me is Christopher Sunday, because I doubt Kevin would know what he looks like. I suppose it's possible Kevin Sr. could have showed him a picture, but I doubt it. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the film 12 Monkeys, where the director said he purposely left it open so the audience can interpret it either way. Maybe the character did really time travel, or maybe he was just insane. But the issue is that the evidence for it being real rather than just all in his head far outweighs the evidence, the other evidence. And I believe it's the same thing here. I mean, it completely changed John's life from burning down people's houses who claimed to communicate with the dead to actually claiming he could communicate with the dead in order to help other people. And the reason is Kevin came back to life when he shouldn't have. Twice. John even pointed this out. I shot you and you should have died from it. And you're perfectly fine. And I believe it's implied that he was dead here as well. So I think the evidence of his experience in the afterlife being real far outweighs the evidence of this all just being in his head. But that's just me. At any rate, the show loves to play with what is real and fantastic and what is just insane nonsense. And many times they never give an answer to it, and the show does it so well. So after the nukes go off, Kevin wakes up in the real world in the church at Grace's ranch what appears to be the next morning. John and Michael are asleep in the corner, so Kevin goes outside to find his father sitting on the roof and goes and joins him. So the rains have stopped, it's no longer flooding, which does in fact mean his father was wrong, and of course it's the day after the 7th anniversary, so that means he was wrong about that too. And it seems like he's coming to terms with this, as he tells Kevin that he thought he was gone, but he doesn't yell like, "Oh, you're alive," with surprise or anything like that. He just continues to stare out into the distance, and then he tells him he doesn't think that he's ready to come down. So I do find it interesting that Kevin Sr. appears to be realizing that he was wrong, because he could be very easily like spin it into, oh, maybe we just got the date wrong, it'll still happen later, or perhaps Kevin sang the song in the afterlife and that's what stopped the world from ending. But he doesn't do any of that, which I think is a huge step for him. Instead, he turns to Kevin and asks, what now? So I think Senior has much of the same dilemma that Kevin did. Has Kevin had to go let go of his desire to go to the afterlife where he was the most powerful man in the world and just live life and accept himself for who he is. Senior has to come to terms that he isn't the man who will save the world, and now he has to accept himself as he is. And the main thing that Senior wanted, just as he told Christopher Sunday, was purpose. So he needs to come to terms that there is no greater purpose other than just living. So I thought it was a beautiful way to end the episode. And yes, there were a lot of similarities with the opening sequence of the season, with those pilgrims or whatever they are, and that doomsday cult. This was an example of them, simply pushing the date back whenever the apocalypse didn't happen. And the image of Senior sitting on the roof was very reminiscent of those pilgrims or whatever on the rooftops. And he appeared, he said that he was staying up on the roof all night, even through the rain, just like the woman in the intro did. So the symmetry I thought was just beautiful. And it makes that opening sequence a lot more relevant to the rest of the season than I thought it would be. Now, some may complain that it's a bit of a cop-out that there's no great end of the world coming that our heroes need to save, which is what the season was presented as from the very beginning. Through the trailers and the first set of episodes, it's like these people need to save the world. But I don't think that's it at all. I think it fits absolutely perfectly with what the show has been about the whole time, straggling the line between what is real and what isn't, and the fact that this whole crisis turned out to be nothing, and the real conflict was an inner conflict within each character. It was absolutely true to the nature of the show, and so beautifully accomplished. So my rating for the most powerful man in the world and his identical twin brother out of 10 is a 10 the best. Now, I've been known to be a bit more liberal with my 10s than a lot of other reviewers. That's mainly because I don't do decimal points. I don't give something a 9.5 or 9.6. When something falls into that category, I round it up to a 10. I don't regret doing it this way. I plan to continue doing this for my ratings. But this is one of the times I wish I didn't do so I could convey that this episode deserves a perfect score. Not a 9.5, not a 9.7, not even a 9.9. This episode is a perfect 10. This is right up there with some of my favorite movies of all time, like Memento, Fight Club, and Lost Highway. This episode, to my mind, is nothing short of a perfect masterpiece, which is why I think it deserved an extra long review, and I could in fact spend hours more dissecting this episode. The Leftovers has really outdone itself this time in creating this beautiful, thought-provoking masterpiece, which is nothing short of a work of art. So that's it for my review, recap, and analysis of the most powerful man in the world and his identical twin brother. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking through to the end. Be sure to join me next week as I review The Leftovers series finale. Also, be sure to check out my channel for many other videos on other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.